Hello, everyone, and welcome to the First Class Lacrosse podcast. My name is Deemer, and today I'm joined by my co-host, Matt Dunn. We're thrilled to sit down with one of the rising stars in the coaching world, Cornell University head coach Connor Buczek. Coach Buczek took over as the Richard M. Moran head coach of Cornell men's lacrosse in 2020 after 5 years on staff. A Cornell alum and former All-American midfielder, he became the youngest head coach in Division I when he took over the Big Red program in 2020. Since then, he's led Cornell to an NCAA championship appearance in 2022, multiple Ivy League titles, and a consistent top 10 national ranking. In 2025, he led Cornell to its first national championship since 1977. He's been named Ivy League Coach of the Year 3 times. Under his leadership, Cornell has continued its tradition of toughness, discipline, and culture, values that have long defined the program. Before stepping into coaching, Buczek was a 2-time team captain at Cornell, a multi-time PLL All-Star. He's been a longtime competitor to both Matt and myself and a teammate of mine for the Cannons. Beyond the accolades, Coach Buczek is known for his player-first approach, steady leadership, and commitment to maintaining Cornell's standard of excellence both on and off the field. Connor, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, fellas.
What I just remembered here actually is Connor is a fellow number 33. And that's important because there's not a lot of 33s out there, I've realized, because somehow on every team I've played on since my sophomore year of high school, I've gotten 33, except for one time. It might have been like an MLL All-Star game where Connor was on the team also, and he was more veteran than I was, and he got number 33. So I think I had to rock like 27 for a game or something.
What's the story behind 33?
There isn't a huge story, honestly. I think when I was playing high school football, maybe was the genesis of it. It was in my locker. It was what I was given. And so I rocked with it. And then, for my whole life growing up, I was 19. And then when I got to Cornell, Max Feely had just graduated, and Max Feely was an All-American defenseman for us. Took really good care of me whenever I visited Cornell. And so figured it was a good decision to stay in 33 and keep, his honor feels and obviously keep it going from high school football.
Yeah, I thought I was making out like a bandit getting 33 on all these teams, and after a while I was like, why does nobody want this number? But I'll take it.
I think it's a good one, man. I think it's a good one. I think it's an underrated one.
I think it's extremely underrated. It's a double. Like I thought everybody wants doubles, but apparently 33 is just this number that I got my freshman year in Maryland. Everybody was like, yeah, you can have that.
I will say my one thing I could add to that, I do think, and I'll have to check my facts, but I think sophomore year varsity football, I might have worn 33. So I'll if I can dig up some archives, I'll send that over to you guys.
There you go. You can join the crew.
We'll add you to the Facebook group. Connor, so we do some research for this, as maybe you've heard, but we asked, Deemer and I are lucky to have known you for a while, but we asked some people that you're around now a lot these days. And one interesting point came back as a great icebreaker question that apparently you like to ask that we thought would be great to kick off today. And it is, what is your favorite word?
My favorite word's aioli. I like to ask that question. I like to hear people's responses. I think it's interesting to hear how people think. Some people are not about, they don't have a thought in mind until they give it a little thought, but I like aioli. It's, sounds good. I like aioli, to eat. And so aioli is my favorite word. And usually with a little emphasis on the end, aioli,
It's quite popular in the restaurants these days. Everyone's got some version of aioli.
You got it. What about you guys?
Oh, I was thinking of that, and I think spontaneity. I think to me, it's a nice length of a word, but also I appreciate what it stands for.
Man, I'm like, I played this wrong when I was thinking about this because I thought you were going to say something like commitment or something,
Nah.
Okay, I get it now.
I do like the process of finding new words, as nerdy as that sounds. We communicate for a living, and so coming up with new words, is and finding good ways to use them or ideal ways to put them in to encompass what you're trying to say. But you can't ask the question without a word in mind.
Yeah. Linguini. I don't know. I think the
food theme.
I think you planted something in my mind subconsciously, but I'm going with linguini until I change it later.
All right. That's a good one.
So, hey, Connor, just following up on that, because it kind of sparks a thought in my mind. One of the questions that, we were told to ask you was, one, do you have a strong vocabulary? So one, obviously you're talking about finding new words and communicating, but also, do you ever use analogies or try to use analogies in your coaching as well as just thinking about how you're communicating? Or, what kind of thought are you putting into like the words that you use and trying to make things click for guys?
Yeah, I would say my vocabulary is verbose. I spend some time trying to learn new words and again, just trying to find better ways to articulate what you're trying to say. And so there's words that fit, there's words that are perfect. And so trying to find that perfect way to make the point. But I think more than analogies, I use kind of anecdotes and try to make it real for guys. And I don't have, a ton of experience to fall back on, but I thought it was always cool that while I was playing and in the prime of my professional career, I was starting to get more responsibility here. And so never losing that understanding of the game, that things happen. It's a flow game. Things are, you're making decisions in a split instant, and sometimes it's right and sometimes it's wrong. But having the confidence to make those decisions and be wrong is better than, not wanting to take the chance. And so I think that's been a lot of how I've thought about the game and how I've tried to communicate the game. And, when push comes to shove, try to draw on maybe some recent examples of guys who have had similar, shortcomings or troubles or ways that they work through it, maybe, strategies that helped them, I'd say I use those anecdotes more than analogies.
Yeah, I feel like we all like, Deemer and I talk about it. We like watching other coaches coach. We like listening to these webinars and these podcasts. And it's not always what people are teaching, because maybe everybody's like, yeah, I teach that too. I teach that too. But then you hear them say it in a way where you're like, oh, that makes way more sense. And also we're communicating to, Deemer and I communicating to a lot of high school age athletes and a lot of college athletes where they come from different backgrounds. So it might click differently. There's this huge bridge between like us knowing what we want to get across, and then there's this whole art to getting it across in a way that sticks with players. Like, oh, okay, I actually know exactly what you mean now, and I'm not going to forget that.
Again, where that communication piece is so important, trying to, whatever, everybody ticks a little different. Everybody understands the point a little different, but finding the way to make that connection point, I think, is massive.
You ever have challenges in knowing like how much to say versus when to like let the play, unfold? Like, how do you balance that in terms of keeping it simple and efficient, but knowing when to insert yourself as a coach?
I think a lot of it comes down to just being principled and knowing what you're teaching and demanding and knowing what you're holding them accountable to. The reality is that list, it can't be super long. If it's a never ending list of what you're holding them accountable to, I think you start to lose the value. You start to miss opportunities to hold them accountable. But, for us being a flow game, I, like to think about it. And there's black and white things. There's things that we have to do exactly right every time. And there's things that happen to flow. There's decisions and spacing and timing and, secondary understanding of just how the pieces fit together in our game, that I think you have to just create the opportunity and rep those out. But, there's certain black and white pieces of, these are our starting points. This is how we look on initial trigger. This is how we have to approach the ball. This is how we have to throw passes. And then there's a lot of gray where, decisions and how we're actually, when we're deciding to make the play, when we're deciding to throw the skip pass, when we're deciding to shoot the ball, when we're deciding to go for the home run play versus just hit the single, on all, in all facets of the game, I think is really important to coach what you're trying to coach, and then to try to just rep them through it enough that, by failure and success, they start to find, how they want to approach that situation when something similar shows itself, especially in big moments.
Connor, how do you deliver that, or do you package that? I'm thinking like I've heard of standards first principles or rules of thumb before, right? The standards are, hey, this is how we trigger, this is how we approach the things that like non-negotiable, it's clear, it's black and white. And then look, we get it, it's a free-flowing game. I can't tell you exactly to throw it back here or there. Do you have language that deciphers between those two things, or is just kind of understood in the way you coach and preach it?
I'd say there's language. I'd say, we spend a lot of time in certain segments trying to teach the fundamentals and the things that we expect. But then, the way we kind of think about it is we teach and we, rep. And I think we teach the black and white, and I think you rep the gray, and I think you rep the situations, and you hope to find ways to, whether it's part whole or whether it's certain drills, to mimic things that guys will see in games and make it, maybe even show exactly what you're looking for as the real world application, the game application of those skills. And so for us, that's always been part of the thought process and the coaching philosophy, is to spend a lot of time putting them in situations and letting kind of the outcome dictate some of that teaching. Obviously, there's always something you can teach, but it's usually worth teaching the fundamentals and letting them feel the space, the timing, the routine, and then hoping if we rep it enough that, outcomes start to drive how they react to this situation next time or in a full game scenario.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Like, just teach the black and white, rep the gray, put them in situations. And kind of where we're at, right now in fall ball, would love to kind of hear, what does Cornell fall ball look like? How do you build some of that up through the fall?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is fundamental based. In the Ivy League specifically, it's hard, just based on the number of hours that were allotted and even the way we use them, to really find a ton of consistency. And so that's usually the biggest challenge, is systematically speaking. When we start with just a couple days on the field a week and then build to, maybe 3 or 4 at our very max, before we play our fall scrimmage, it's hard to kind of carry over the system. And so the way we think about it, it's how we're doing things more than what we're doing. And as you have a more veteran team, maybe like we did last year, you can build a little bit more of the system and you can spend a little bit more time tweaking and updating. When you're a little younger, you're trying to just get the very fundamental black and white pieces in there. But I think the biggest thing is just how we compete, how we show up, what the energy's like, how hard we're playing. And that usually covers up a lot of the systematic issues. And it's the same thing in the spring. When we show up in the spring, this year, first practice day is February 1st, and our first contest, our first game is Feb 14. And so it's a quick turnaround, and you're not going to get everything in that you would like to. However, usually how we're doing it will trump what we're doing. And then over time, we'll start working in the system and getting better on those pieces.
Yeah, Connor, I was talking to Jordan Stevens the other day, who we'll certainly come back to later in this conversation. And just kind of asking him about, I've gotten to know Jordan well. We were teammates, and I talked to him a lot about defensive coaching. And I was asking him about Connor as an offensive coach and saying, hey, what's his skill with developing players? And he mentioned your ability to build up guys' confidence, and highlighted a very obvious point that there's a little bit of a difference in how you can approach an offensive player versus defensive player, as far as like the confidence and swagger and the mental game, maybe for an offensive guy, versus whereas a defender, I do think you can be a little more strict, if you will, because it's more of a team system playing together. And offensive guys sometimes need that confidence and swagger. So I'm interested to hear like this how over what mindset. How do you implement that with some of the offensive guys in the fall? Maybe a new guy to help give them confidence, but also get them playing the way, the Cornell standard is.
Yeah, I think that's a fine balance at times. And I think a lot of young guys, it takes them a little time to find that. And I think that's anywhere in college lacrosse, right? It's such a big step up, and the game's moving so fast. And, you're trying to get those guys up to speed, and they're trying to learn a system, and they're trying to, get comfortable in a new place. I think there's a lot on their plate at that particular moment. But I remember that vividly as a freshman, where, I had a great career, but I didn't figure it out early enough. My freshman year, I was kind of flailing and struggling just to do simple, basic things. Catch the ball, throw the ball fundamentally, shoot the ball, be in the right spot, because everything was just, I was overthinking many things. And so that's kind of been the approach, for us on an offensive specifically basis, but, from a team perspective too, at as much as possible, just to create the environment conducive to success, right? Create the parameters that we're not judging every rep by its outcome, and, making sure that we're being very intentional when, I raise my voice or when I get heated about things. It's about how we're doing it and things that are controllable, and not the things that are not controllable. We're going to throw balls over guys' heads. We're going to skip balls, at their feet. We're going to drop passes. We're going to make bad decisions. We're going to make bad reads, and those things are going to happen. The reality is, though, if we can get back to that black and white and gray, and making sure that we're only, holding them accountable strongly to the black and white, and then we're trying to get better in those gray, I think for us that's been a way that we can do a good job. And quite frankly, it's challenging some days, right? You want to see outcomes. You want to see the pieces starting to fit together. You want to see the progress. And I feel invested in that process to the point that I have to check myself at points and say, hey, are you getting upset for the right reasons? Or are you getting upset because the outcomes aren't reflecting, the progress you hope to see? And again, progress isn't linear. And we find that year over year that wherever you think you're going, you got to meet them where they're at. And so I think those two components of creating the environment and meeting the guys where they're at hopefully allows them to build confidence as fast as possible so that they can be themselves. And then you can really start to teach once they have the confidence, they're showing you the stuff that they're capable of doing, then we can build the rest.
It's such a fascinating concept. And, for us, like we're working with a lot of, 4th, 5th through 11th and 12th. You're getting guys coming in highly recruited. Now they're back to square one. But then, the stakes increase every level. Now you're competing, for national championships. And so you're trying to build guys' confidence, but also put the best guys on the field. It's also interesting when I think to, when we're doing skill sessions, we're showing them things, but then at the same time, like what are their coaches communicating to them of like their standards and what they're okay with? Are they okay with trying that behind the back pass or that, shovel pass or just different things, and like in today's game, like it is so modern. I feel like you guys at Cornell play a pretty box field hybrid. You've had some amazing box players, can you kind of touched on it, but can you keep shedding some light on how you're promoting those skills, but teaching the time and place of it as well to help guys, know, hey, that's fine to throw that behind the back pass. Like that has a purpose. Like, how do you keep communicating through stuff like that?
Again, I think it's by, trying to teach the point and not the outcome. I think we, especially like behind the back passes or, flips or, however we want to think about that, one-handed shots. A lot of things that are just outside the normal scope of fundamentals. I think a lot of it, comes down to if it works, we let it go. And if it doesn't, we get frustrated. But I think there's even a step higher that we have to, again, check our own thoughts on it and watch it. Like, was it the right decision? Even if it didn't connect, was it the right, thought process? Was that the best option? And I think that's the part that hopefully builds a little trust and confidence between, the players and our staff, that when we see it, we're going to try to actually get to the root of like, was that the right time for that? Was there a better way to go about that? And not necessarily whether we, finished the play and got to the outcome or whether, it didn't. And so I think that's been something that maybe still even a little gray. I'm not sure there's always the perfect answer. And I think that's the unique part about lacrosse, right? In football, we can draw up where all 11 players should be. And, if we block that guy and we block that guy and we get to the second level, like we're going to break one versus, within all of the decisions being made within an 80-second possession, either build success or failure. And sometimes, you do everything right and the goalie still makes a save, or, sometimes on the defensive end, you do everything right and they still hit a shot. Right. And so that's the other piece of it too, is just kind of seeing how all of those decisions fit together and kind of creating some cogence amongst that and how you're teaching it and what you expect. And then, again, trying to separate that outcome variable more from, how we're coaching it, how we're teaching it, and what we're seeing, to allow some of that freedom for those guys to want to make plays and not feel handcuffed to, a system that's not helping them be their best.
Yeah. In this conversation, I'm imagining, the CJ Kurtz of the world where you watch him do this stuff and everybody wonders, like, I wonder what his coach says to let him do. But then there's also the flip side of it. And you mentioned it. You got to Cornell as a freshman and struggled to do the basics. I vividly remember learning how to catch and throw at Maryland and how to approach with my stick in front. I'm curious, what skills do you think a lot of the freshmen coming into Cornell tend to be underdeveloped, or just in general when you watch and recruit and to get to the next level? Like, what skills do you think are a bit underdeveloped coming in that you spend a lot of time on with the newer guys in the fall, really hammering home that are important?
Yeah, we'll start at the basics, right? Ground ball play, I think, is, underdeveloped. I think talented guys pick up more ground balls, athletic guys pick up more ground balls at the high school level. But I think the actual fundamental and basic of picking up a ground ball through, traffic is underdeveloped in a lot of guys. I think the stick work and the ability to do it, consistently I think dodging is one that's chronically undertaught, and I think approaches are chronically undertaught, on either side of the ball, where I think athletic guys, again, they win approaches on the dodge and they win approaches, even if they have a bad angle just because they're more athletic, at the high school level or the club level before they get to us. And so, again, I think it just comes back to a lot of those fundamentals that I think talent usually, covers up a lot of deficiencies in the fundamentals. And then when you get to this level and everybody's of relatively equal caliber on the athletic front, or at least to the point that you're not making up a ton of ground if you're deficient in the fundamentals. I think that's where we see a lot of guys that it takes them time to get there, and just the consistency and discipline that they have to do them the right way consistently.
Connor, for the dodging piece, I get that question all the time. Hey, do you have dodging drills? Do you have things to become a better dodger? And I think the result of that turns into a lot of footwork things. Is it the footwork in your mind, or is there something that, like, if there's one or two tips that you would be like, hey, these are things that could really elevate you as a dodger, what are they?
I think it's kind of twofold. I think it's anticipating and actually attacking the ball in the air, right? If the hardest thing that the defense does is approach the ball, why would we, be flat foot and catch it and kind of give them an opportunity to go toe to toe with us? I think that's, the first thing that I see is so many guys catch and they want to look at you and they want to pop and they want to be like, here, I'm dodging, I'm coming. Like, and when you can just say, you can attack the ball in the air, you can change their angle of approach, you can, win that approach on the offensive end. And then hopefully if you accelerate past that approach point, you're going to be in a good spot. But I think that's the biggest thing, is that just the pace with which they, get ready to dodge, and whether that's the trigger dodge or whether that's the secondary dodge. I see that a lot. And then I think it's the point of, everybody gets kind of caught up, I think, on a split dodge, a roll dodge, a bull dodge, however you want to think about your scope of dodges. It's changing speed and changing direction, and it's your ability to accelerate past that contact point and come away clean. And so I think those are the two things that we spend a lot of time on and how we think about it, rather than, the specifics of maybe this or that, where we're getting too into the weeds. I think a lot of it's the high level stuff that is underdeveloped, where those first three strides after you change speed, change direction, that's where you're separating or you're not. And, changing that approach angle or anticipating that next dodge to the point that you're flowing before the eyes and the approach get to you, I think are really important pieces that are not thought about as much as maybe the three steps in between and what we term the dodge is.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's massive, and honestly, like, I get it. Like, if a kid's stuck on his or her own working on their dodge, like, who's throwing it to them, but even if you had a parent and you're curling into the ball, like, I bet less than 5% of people when they're training are doing that to start their dodging reps. So it already just gives me ideas for, incorporating and leveraging some of that.
Well, even Connor, your framing of, you said earlier, approaches on both sides of the ball. Every defender has heard the word approach, but I don't think they think about it the way that, like, a college team drills it. They just think of, like, running out to a cone or something. There's this whole angle and timing element, but then the approach on the offensive side, we're like, yeah, the approach to the dodge, it's almost like there's this, like, subconscious gentleman's agreement of, like, you catch the ball, I'll come out to you, and then we'll start the rep. But, like, the college game, like, so much of that is won and lost on the spacing, the timing, the dynamic of, like, to your point, moving into the ball, the defender's ability to be there and set at the appropriate time. And I think that makes up a larger portion of won and lost matchups and on ball and off ball offense, or on ball offense and defense, than a lot of players give credit for.
I couldn't agree more. Again, I was not a phone booth dodger, and so I think I developed that over time in finding the best ways to be successful. If I was trying to dodge you, right, if we were toe to toe, you were going to win that because I couldn't, unless I was going to muscle you to a spot. I was not going to accelerate past you unless I had a nice little running start. And so just that thought process I've kind of translated to how we think about all of our dodges. And again, there's certain guys that can start and stop on a dime, but those guys are few and far between. And so for the general public, I think the hope is to anticipate better and to have better footwork in those moments to hopefully win those approaches on the offensive end.
Yeah, it's cool too, because I think last year, but even the last couple of years, like, we've gotten to see a lot of film on your games. Like, Ivy League Network does a great job with ESPN Plus. Like, we have a lot of stuff cut up. And it's been cool to see like the different styles of dodgers you have and then how you incorporate them in your offense. Like Hugh Kelleher reminds me a lot of how you played, like very downhill. You guys would tee him up in the middle of the field or you'd get him out of the box, but then you get it to guys like Kirst or Teed on the wing, and then you've got some, X guys. And, so I'm sure that's a big part of your discussion too, of like just putting guys in spots to be successful. And, you've recruited them for a reason. How do you think about putting those pieces together?
Yeah. When we think about it, there's kind of, really three types of players, I think, in my mind. There's the big downhill guys, there's the ex-attackmen, and then there's kind of the secondary complementary pieces that are a little more, their strength is in those secondary dodges. Their strength is in the two-man game. Their strength is some of the east-west dodging and being a little slicker on the corners. And so I think when you kind of put all those pieces together, you got the guy that stirs the drink a little bit. You got the guy that can trigger from X, see through, two-handed, plays the pipes, understands spacing and timing and rhythm. And then, the group that are kind of interchangeable, whether they're at the midfield or the attack. That's becoming a common phrase, the positionless lacrosse. But, in my opinion, I think those guys work well in the midfield or the attack, where they're good on the corners, they're good on the angles, they're slick on, two-man games, they're capable without maybe the head of steam. And so, we try to fit those pieces of the puzzle together. And, usually the hope is guys kind of fill two of those boxes. Very rarely will you hit all three. However, if you can kind of hit two of those, that gives you an ability to find your way on the field pretty early for us. And we can fit the puzzle based on everybody's strengths and how we can fit those lines. And so that's kind of been the goal, to make sure that we've got some guys that can do all three of those and hopefully, multiple that can do more than one of those three.
Yeah, Connor, last question here, kind of just on the topic of, as you mentioned, spacing. What are the keys to great offensive spacing? What are you just like preaching with your guys? Do your guys know is like so critical? Like it's going to be great, it's going to be crazy, but like we want to end up like this, and these are important to make sure that we're effective with our spacing.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is the pace that you play with and without the ball, right? I think a lot of us fall into this, understanding that one guy dodges and everybody else is kind of just holding space. The reality is if we're all working together and we're aware of the other six man or, other five guys on the field, it's going to allow us to put the defense in some difficult situations. And so I think it's the awareness. I think it's the pace of everybody on the field. And then realistically, at the end of the day, it's anticipating. It's seeing body language that tells you ball flow, which tells you where you should react, right? If the ball's going away from you, sometimes you're following the ball and you're being the outlet. Sometimes somebody pops behind the ball and you have to give that guy space, and so you're going away from the ball. Sometimes the body language tells you the ball's going through X, and so we have to start showing wider on the backside rather than following towards the middle. And so it's all of those slight nuances of recognizing that the ball carrier is the maestro, right? He's dictating where the other five guys should go, but just because he's got the ball and everybody else doesn't mean we're not moving with the same pace and the same intent. It's just about our roles are slightly different, and what's expected of each guy based on what the ball does is telling us different things. And so I think a lot of that comes from just repetition and communication, the opportunity to feel the guys around you, to understand good opportunities to cut, to recognize that we can be right doing many, many different things, especially once we get past that initial trigger point. The only thing that, was going to dictate, success or failure is going to be that spacing, though, and us relating to the guys around us. Even if you're on the backside, no one has the ball, one cut, one stay is like, the simplest thing I can tell you. But at the end of the day, it's really hard to do in practice for guys to feel that in the timing and the spacing. And so it's something we just spend a lot of time on. And if the ball is hopping with pace and we're moving hard without it, and I think realistically, if you get, rewarded for your cuts here and there, sometimes you're just taking eyes and defensemen. Sometimes you're actually getting fed. And as long as you get a couple of those opportunities to finish, I think it really entices our guys to keep doing it, which is, crucial to have some of those feeders that see those guys and look in at those moments.
Yeah, there's probably, and I've gone through this experience a little bit, like coaching, high school and college, but there's probably that tough pain point of when you're working on your spacing and you have all these options. If the guys haven't gotten it down yet, you want to script it. You want to show them exactly what to do, but you don't want to limit these guys, because some of them that can really feel it, they could do 5 different things every other ball and execute, So I imagine too, like that's a tough thing as a coach of like, when do you put the reins on, or when do you just keep trusting your process to install your principles and your spacing?
Yeah, I think that is the biggest part. And again, it goes back to, same thing we were talking about to start, the more that you can let that be their game and just try to, be principally focused in terms of what you're teaching and how you're letting the rest go. Sometimes it's an exercise in frustration to let them work through those moments. But, we've found that over the long term, feeling that ownership, feeling that, that confidence from us goes a lot longer than, trying to overscript and say, you have to be exactly here at this moment. Otherwise, you're not going to play type deal.
Connor, we want to shift here a little bit just because, and there's a reason that we started off with some of the lacrosse stuff because we thought it was important, but we're also afraid that this next topic could have just taken over the entire conversation. And it's one that, I look at, and I think it's well known that Cornell is one of the most established programs in lacrosse, has a great legacy, a strong culture. You played at Cornell. You as soon as you finished playing, you started as a coach, and you've been coaching there since. You took on the head coaching job, and you did it all with a former, teammate, Jordan Stevens, and you guys really were able to build and maintain something very special there. So this next phase of the conversation, we want to focus on that culture piece of it. And I'm curious, like just off the start, kind of a broad question, but when you think about like Cornell, what is the Cornell culture that has been there for a long time that you guys have inherited and maintained?
Yeah, it's actually interesting. If we go back, when Jordan and I first kind of started on the coaching staff, we were still trying to figure out, how to perpetuate it. I think it was never something that was really discussed or talked about as much as it was something that was done. And we'd always fallen back on that well done is better than well said concept. And so I think somewhere, I think the fall of 17, if I remember correctly, we spent some time actually like jotting it down and thinking about exactly what it was and how we wanted to communicate it. And over the course of, almost a decade now, I think it's morphed and shifted, and we found better ways to communicate and articulate exactly what we're looking for. And so, we actually put a packet together and talked about this is who we want to be. This is how we want to operate. The fact that culture is dynamic and it's what we're doing or not doing on every occasion. But ultimately what we got back to is kind of just focused on the inputs and accountability, focusing on our ability to control the controllables, recognizing full well that, we can't always dictate the outcome. We can do our very best, but at the end of the day, somebody else has a say in that. And sometimes it's your day and sometimes you're not. But we decided if we could focus on the inputs and the effort, the attitude, the enthusiasm, we're great every single day, that was going to put us on a trajectory that we felt good about. And then, accountability and our ability to take care of ourselves and look out for making sure we're doing the right things all the time. And then, holding our teammates to that standard, and that ownership piece really went a long way. And so that's kind of been the crux of how we think about what we're doing. And then it's, just the daily task. It's how good are we at doing those things? How much do we live up to that standard day in, day out? And we found that piece has kind of put us over the top when it is in, our players' hands, that it's their program. We're here to help them be the best version of themselves and to run it how they see fit. But, that trust and that ownership piece, I think really, takes it to another level.
Now, when you talk about those things like the accountability, the inputs, how much of that is focused around the time you have with them and like the time on the field versus how much do you dive into off the field, academics, career? Like how do you think about like those other buckets that maybe can influence on the field, but when you say culture, it's not just on the field and in the locker room.
Yeah, I think it kind of permeates every piece of what our guys are doing right on the field, in the weight room, and their networking and professional career development in the classroom. It kind of becomes a way of life more than anything, right? If our habits are our habits and not just things that we do when we're together, that kind of sets the stage. But our hope is to make sure that all of those pieces, that there's great consistency, that the expectation and the way we're teaching and how we're, creating the ownership and accountability within those realms is roughly the same. And so we're very fortunate, to have a lot of people that are invested in the success of our young men, and a lot of people, within this tradition that care greatly for the culture. And so with that, it makes it pretty easy to create that, but it does take time and coordination to make sure that all of those pieces are on the same wavelength. And, for us on the field, obviously we spend a lot of time working on it, but our strength coach, Coach Howley, is as good as they come. And he's been with us for 30 years and has really been a culture setter for our program far before I ever arrived at Cornell. And he's kind of the bridge over the last, 3 decades and even before that, in terms of what it is to be a part of this and how we want to go about our business. And then, like I said, it kind of works its way out that in every part of life, the consistency is there and the identity is there, and we know exactly what's expected, and that it's a matter of us living up to that standard.
Connor, I was going to bring up Coach Halley because that name has come up a few times. I'd like to kind of dig in there for a second because he does appear to be this, behind the scenes guy, but anybody involved with Cornell's program will reference Coach Halley and the impact that he's had. Jordan mentioned, the most consistent, positive, empowering person I've ever been around. And he basically said outside of his parents, like Coach Halley is one of the greatest influence and mentors he's had. I'd like to kind of hear your perspective on Tom Howley and what is it really that he brings to the table? How does he mentor? How does he shepherd that culture? What impact did he have on you and Jordan as young guys taking over a really, really big task in your mid to late 20s, taking over the Cornell program? I'm assuming his mentorship was helpful. So I'd like to lean into him a little bit here and unpack that.
Yeah, Jordan hit it on the head there. I've known him for 15 plus years now, and I'm not sure I've ever seen him have a bad day. He's just so consistent and positive and hardworking and cares for the people around him. And he sets the standard. He does it before he expects it of the guys around him and our staff and the players. And for us, he's always been a master in my mind of basically weaving in pieces of directly translatable attributes in the weight room, in strength and conditioning, in agilities. And that's not an easy thing to do. I think, sometimes that falls outside the purview of what strength and conditioning coaches see as their job and how they think about it. But specifically for us, like we mentioned, the Ivy League, playing a little less lacrosse, we spend a ton of time with him and that being our primary activity for the day throughout the course of the fall. And so we have to have that build and that directly translatable build in terms of what we're doing in the weight room and how that, directly impacts how we go out onto the field. But, touching on pieces of communication and discipline and leadership and finding ways to kind of build that into what he's doing is really impressive. And honestly, all these years later, still I walk away constantly in awe of the man because of that consistency in his thought process and the way he gets outside the box to create these opportunities for our team. But also, I think he's a master of connection and understanding where the group's at and, the proverbial carrot and the stick. He knows when they need a pat on the back and he gives it to them. And sometimes he knows when they got to strive harder and we're getting a little content and we're getting a little complacent, and that, he'll lift that bar a little higher and making sure that we're continuing to strive. And so his ability to connect, to recognize those moments, to have the right words when the time comes to address the team, and his ability to be in lockstep with myself and our staff really sets a tone for us that the consistency across all of our coaches and support staff really, allows us to embody the culture, to live the culture, and hopefully to perpetuate the culture. But certainly from, I echo the sentiments that Jordan did. Outside of my parents, I'm not sure there's been someone more influential on my life in the way he goes about his business, the way he's taught me to be, a Cornell lacrosse player and then eventually a Cornell lacrosse coach. And, to try to connect with these guys on a different level by, modeling the consistency and the effort and the care that you want to see from the team.
I mean, it's really cool to hear about, and in something that, I'd have to imagine from you being a player and working with him, like helping you through that transition of going from player to assistant coach to now head coach, again, like all different phases, when you're a young coach on staff, I'm sure there's challenges of like being a friend to the guys versus you're kind of a former peer and now you're a coach. but to have someone like that, that again, you look so highly upon, as well as the other guys in the program, to guide you through that has to be really special.
No doubt about it. And I think, the coolest message or the coolest lesson I've ever learned from coach is that, if there's a standard, you can talk about it in a way that, you don't have to yell and scream for the message to be understood. And I think a lot of, strength coaches that want to pound their chest and demand you lift more weight, and, more weight is good. He's always been a guy that in very few words and very pointed language and very specific times, he can simply say he's a little disappointed that we missed the standard, and that, feels like your world's collapsing. And so the power that his words held, and the way that his consistency trickled down, and the respect that came from that, I think has been some of the biggest lessons that, have rubbed off on our staff. And again, that I consistently, sit in awe of how he goes about his business, and the fact that you wouldn't know he had a life outside this place, not because of anything else other than he just looks unfazed by external circumstances. He comes in and he does the job and he executes at a high level. And I think that's what we're all striving for at some level, is that mental focus and acuity to be consistent, to know what you're getting from us every day. And I don't think any of us live up to that standard. But again, I see from him day in, day out, and he's a role model for me specifically in that facet, in the way that he's so consistent that, the guys want to be consistent for him, and we want to be consistent as a staff for him.
When we talk about culture, and I think a lot of buzzwords get thrown out there, and standards, and I think when you really unpack them, they're incredibly important, but they also come along with this connotation of maybe super serious, heavy, discipline, and those things are important, but they also burn people out. And I know, there's a flip side to each coin. If you're going to push people really hard and ask them to execute these standards, they have to buy in, and there has to be, it can't just be a push, it has to be a pull where people want to buy in if it's going to be sustainable and you're not going to break. And that's something, talking to Jordan a bit, he said that you guys, he thought when you were at your best as a staff, as a team, you were the hardest working team in the country. Is that the only reason we were able to get there is because we had a solid foundation of these relationships that we had built with the players. So there wasn't this hollow connection of us saying, do this because it's the Cornell way. We really formed these strong relationships that allowed us to be super honest and super direct with the team. And they knew it came from a place of care. Curious to hear your thought on that dynamic of, one, is that, am I reciting this correctly? And two, how do you balance cultivating those relationships? And it's not transactional, not just so that you can push them, but which allows you also to get further together.
Yeah, the way we think about it a lot is just kind of balancing the challenges and the support, that those two kind of have to be in line with one another. And, it starts with a foundational relationship there with our really starts in the recruiting process through, their freshman year. And as they start to mature, I think everybody hits, a moment in time. I'd imagine it's most places in the country, but specifically at Cornell, that, you're in the deep water for the first time ever. School's a little harder than you anticipated. The challenge of maybe living away from home and getting acclimated to a new place is starting to hit. You're realizing that, there's a lot of improvement necessary to make a big impact at this level on the field. And I think when those all start to hit, it's a really challenging moment, and it rattles the confidence of many. And so for us, those are the moments that I hope that they can lean on us and to pull them through those, to give them the support, to give them the confidence, to give them the reassurance that this is okay, this is normal, and we're going to get through this thing together. And I think once we get through that moment, hopefully we build some level of trust and faith and understanding that, it starts with the person. And then from there, we're able to be very honest, to be very transparent, and let them know that that's not because we don't like them. It's because, we want the best for them. And we think that there's more that they can do to help our team. And we want them to get everything that they want out of this experience in their 4 years to play college lacrosse. And then whatever comes next, at the end of the day, lacrosse is the medium, but it's the opportunity to teach life lessons through the medium of lacrosse, and that perseverance and that confidence that comes from overcoming the first time you're drowning a little bit and you're just trying to look for a little light at the end of the tunnel, I think builds a ton of confidence. I know it did for me, and I know it opened up my eyes to how much more confidence I can draw from the process than the outcomes. And so we hope all those guys have a similar feeling. And then, when it comes time to really push, that we're on the same team, that they get that we're caring about the same things and we want the same outcomes. But none of that happens. That push can't come unless the foundation has been built with the support. And then I think those things ultimately set those guys up for success long after their time at Cornell is the hope.
It's cool too, like, in talking with your brother who's on staff, like one of the things that, he mentioned in support of that is how your door is always open, and constantly have guys coming in the office, not just to watch film and talk lacrosse, but also just to hang out and build the, it just naturally builds that relationship. And I wonder for you, when you say to players, you say these things like, hey, my door is always open, or, I'm here for you, etc. There's a lot of players that don't take that handout right away and utilize it, or engage. Some players, are really within, and you have to bring that out of them. So, what are some tangible things like you've learned in terms of actually building a relationship with a player that have helped you connect, like really, bridge that gap when, hey, they might be looking at you like, man, this is Connor Buczek, like captain, All-American. Now he's the head coach. Like, how do I approach this guy?
I think a lot of it's just starting by caring, right? By being genuinely invested in those, interactions that we have. And so for us, some are easier than others, right? Some guys are willing to trust you and put faith in you and accept the open door. And some take a little bit more time and a little more conversation and just everybody's a little bit different. And so I think for us, for me specifically, it's something I've thought about a lot where, I've had some success in this, but, with every passing year, I'm getting older and a little further away from my playing days, my college days, my understanding of exactly where these guys are at. And so it's always trying to bridge that gap. And every year it takes a little bit more understanding and a little more self-reflection to make sure that, I'm not, coming in with the same notions or expectations or understanding of, where all these guys are at, but that, I'm genuinely listening and hearing and working my best to understand them and meet them where they're at. At the end of the day, that is the goal, where for every player on a roster, we have guys at every different which step in maturity. And so making sure that we're meeting them where they're at and we're genuinely helping them reach that next step. And sometimes it's to benefit the team. And sometimes it's just to make sure that they're successful long after their time at Cornell. But I do think it became very natural early in my career. And I find myself spending more time reflecting and thinking about ways to connect just as I get a little bit older and the demands of life have changed and my, time in college is getting a little further away. My time putting the helmet on and competing at a high level is getting further away. And so it takes a little more understanding to overcome maybe some of that. But it's certainly something that I am actively aware of and trying to overcome on a daily basis to make sure that I'm being the best version for them and helping them as a person first. And then, we'll get to the lacrosse piece at some point.
Well, one part that I'm thinking about and, even talking about Tom Howley is the idea of like, sometimes coaches aren't perceived as people, right? Like, like never had a bad day, and your players might look at you that way, but we know Connor Buczek is a person. And I'm curious, how do you manage, like personally, bringing this much to the table for your athletes and being there for them, but also like being able to disengage? Like, do you have ways that you're able to separate and be a person and relax and recharge so that you're able to show up with the energy and the capacity needed? Because I do think that's a challenge for coaches at times, where you feel like you are this large than life person to a lot of your players.
It's a great question. It's really hard, if I'm, perfectly honest. I think that weighs on a lot of us. And, I think I'm still working towards that piece. I'm still working to get better. I think, I got married this summer. And so I think my wife has added some balance to my life and some, part of my day that was not always thinking about Cornell lacrosse, that when I go home, we try to turn it off for a little bit. But prior to, us moving in together, it was, that way all day, every day, going back to maybe some of the seasons that, there's one season I played in the NLL, the MLL, and was coaching here. And so basically for, the majority of the weekends of the year I was on the road, and those things start to catch up with you. And I think at a certain point, I've tried to actively reassess how I can take the best care of myself, and how I can, do it for myself and my own well-being, but also so that, like you said, I can show up full and ready to kind of give to these young men. And so it's a great question. I don't think I've mastered it. I know I haven't mastered it. I have, some days that I struggle, and as good as things have been recently, and winning a national championship and having the opportunity to coach the USA U20 team and then getting into the fall, it's a lot. It's a lot trying to, make sure that you're taking care of all of your constituencies, and that everybody's getting the best version of you. And so I think it's constantly work in progress, and constantly reading, trying to understand better ways and talk to people and get, some more tips of the trade. But I think for every individual, it's a little different. So the answer is it's a work in progress. I think it's always a work in progress. And to be honest, I have to start getting better on that side, so that, I don't have that moment where I'm just kind of, on empty and struggling to be the best version for everybody around me.
Yeah. I mean, I can relate in that. I think, we all need that advice. It's hard to unplug. I mean, I had the thought too, when you were talking about meeting them where they're at, the college kids now, and all kids with social media, it's really hard to unplug from lacrosse. I mean, I still find that as a coach, like unplug from what else is going on, all these other things, versus being able to focus on yourself. And then when you're not, working in your business or your coaching career, how do you just live a life and be present for the other people around you? It is a challenge. And I also think it's even more challenging when we're also highly competitive. From those playing days, our competition has just shifted into different facets.
For the record, Jordan said Connor was much better at that than I was. He thought, at least. I want to ask you, just before this gets away from us, because we've talked about it a little bit, but this guy's important. What was it like for you getting to experience taking over the Cornell program with Jordan Stevens, a teammate of yours? Assuming a great friend, a guy you've gotten to coach with since you guys got out of college. That's a really special relationship, and a guy I have a ton of respect for. So I'm curious to hear what it was like getting to do that with him and what he brought to the table throughout all of that.
Yeah, I thought it was an awesome experience. And quite frankly, I don't think, we would have been able to do it without the other. I think we were very much yin and yang in this thing as we worked to build it. And I think, ironically, that first year, right, we took over in the spring of 2020 after the COVID cancellation. And then, we didn't actually play a game in 21. We were under the understanding that we couldn't really play in earnest. And so, that ship sailed, and no one in the Ivy League competed. But I will say, looking back on that, as disappointed as we were to not play in 21, 5 years later, it was a good opportunity for us to really put our heads together and take time where normally you're kind of chasing. And in this job, it's every which way. It's, you're evaluating all summer. In the fall, it's recruiting and having the kids on campus and starting to get, a sense for your team. As we get into spring, obviously in season, and you're constantly trying to just keep up and do the best version that you can as you're in it. But that year gave us a lot of time to evaluate, to, have the conversations about philosophy and how we want to think about things and who we want to be. And we always already had this great blueprint from the tradition of Cornell Lacrosse and the understanding and our institutional knowledge, but together, and as we added some outside, voices and thoughts, with the staff that rounded us out, I think it was a really good opportunity for us to reassess exactly where we are, where we were going, how we wanted to get there, how we wanted to think about things, to do dry runs of things, to communicate in a certain way. And so, we used to joke that there were just meetings about meetings constantly. We would meet as a staff before we met with the team and discuss exactly the message that we were trying to convey and how we wanted to go about it and how we wanted to build it. And so I thought it was a really good opportunity for he and I together, who have very different personalities in a lot of ways, but had the same love, respect for this program and love, respect for one another. Every idea was tested and, debated and thought through and, had to be defended as we tried to make and decided a path forward. And basically every part of our staff and team's trajectory. And so, again, I think to go back to the question, he was instrumental in us having the success that we did as quickly as we did. I thought, he and I played off each other really well, and the understanding of what this place was, but also the understanding of, there's different ways to get to that same outcome was really good. And again, I think by the time, we put anything into action, I think we had debated and discussed and gone round and round and found some middle ground between maybe with the direction I thought and the direction he thought that ultimately got us to a place that was a very well-rounded, thought out argument and a plan that, moving forward was going to put us on the right path to success.
Thinking about kind of like where you guys are at now, right? It's 2 different seasons. And I always think this is a really interesting contrast of, for a long time, the carrot was we have a chance to bring Cornell back to the national championship game. And, that was a thing at Maryland for a while too. It was 40 something years for us. You guys, this storied program, 48 years. Now for the first time in 48 years, Cornell Lacrosse is on the other side of it. And why, and other side, just from having done it last year, does the messaging change to the team at all? Because it's in the minds, right? Like, hey, we're going for it. We want to be this team. But now having success, is there a different approach to maintaining success, or is it just the same business that this is what we do, it's who we are, regardless of what happened this year or last year?
Yeah, as much as we've talked about and tried to avoid that piece, I think it weighs on you, right? Trying to repeat is a hard thing. And I think there's, the motivation is different and the way you think about it is different. And for us right now, it's new problems, right? And you always have some problems and you always have some challenge in front of you. And every year, whether it's coming back from a bad year, whether it's, fighting complacency if you had a solid year, but not a great year. And sometimes it's fighting the complacency because you achieve the goal that you had set out for and talked about for so long. And so I think for us, it's really trying to put a period at the end of that chapter and turn the page and to recognize that we are back on, we're starting from square zero and we have to start building this thing. And I think there's some feelings and some thoughts that, it's hard. It's hard to get to that point. It's a new challenge. It's something that we hadn't had to fight in 48 years. And so there's not really any institutional knowledge here. The blueprint has kind of run out of feedback for us. And so we're figuring that out. But I do think it's a challenge nonetheless. And it's something that we've talked about a lot and we're trying to fight. And at times, if I'm being honest, I feel us, wearing the weight of that sometimes, that we are a different team and we have to recognize that and play to our strengths and be the best version that we can. And so I'm trying to think of the best way to articulate that. But I think the understanding is, we're not reigning. We're not trying to repeat. We're just trying to start building again. And one game at a time, 1 week at a time, 1 day at a time, trying to build the best version of Cornell Lacrosse we can. And if we can get back to that mindset that it's input focused, it's daily focused, it's not seeing the bigger picture too much, it's not thinking back, it's not thinking forward, it's directly focused on the task at hand. I think that'll help us get there. But again, that's easier said than done.
Yeah, I wonder too, like, how do you view when you graduate, a few seniors that were so impactful from a leadership perspective? Part of leadership, I think, is like guys who have the locker room, like they've earned that amongst themselves, but also guys that have that relationship with you. Like, how do you turn the page there in terms of whether it's, giving some guys permission to like step into those roles or navigate those challenges of now, hey, who is going to fill that void?
It's challenging, honestly. It's what I've seen in my coaching career, though, a smaller sample size than some, but I've seen that, great leadership usually, is followed by average leadership and that great leadership is looks so graceful and planned and thought out and executed that sometimes you fail to recognize just how much time and effort goes into it, or how much planning and attention to detail has to be done just as you think about the big picture before you actually put some of those into effect. And so we're trying to change that, and we're trying to make sure that this group has taken the lessons and understood the lessons, and we're trying to help them get there. But I feel confident in the group that we have. However, we lost some very special leaders, and that's the reason we got to the heights that we did. And so you can't always. The tough part is the authenticity piece of leadership is hard. You see someone do it, you want to do it just like them, but the reality is you have to take the lessons learned and the things that they did well, and then kind of almost run it through this, genuine sensor to make sure that when it comes out, it's you, it's who you want to be, it's who you are, it's the strengths that you have, while also stepping outside of your comfort zone at some level to keep growing as a leader. Communication is probably the number one thing that I see for a lot of guys trying to step into that role that maybe aren't super confident in it, or, they're not very loud by nature, is the challenge. But I think everybody's got their challenges. So new group, so far I've been very impressed, but certainly some great leaders that, we have to help empower, encourage, and teach and help those guys get to be the level of leader that those guys were, last year. But we don't want them to be that group. We want them to be themselves and find their way to have a similar impact.
Yeah, I think back to times in college where we would even talk about like guys campaigning to be captains, like it's like this unnatural thing, and then people move in that direction. And then I feel like as a coach, everyone's debating like, when do you vote for captains? What gets to be a captain? Is it team led? Is it coach decided? What time of the year do you do it? There's no perfect answer there either, but it's always interesting to assess like how that decision goes in, because even though it's just a title, we want to say, yeah, everyone's a leader. It is, you are put in that position.
Yeah, no doubt. I think that's an ongoing debate and discussion. And quite honestly, at least within our program, it changes slightly every year. Like it is primarily, player led, but the amount of input or the amount of thought process that comes from the coach, side of things, I think differs on a year-to-year basis.
Yeah, Connor, I really related with that, or do relate with that authenticity piece, just because, I still find myself like as you grow in life, you find a new level of leadership, maybe, or a different area, or maybe you have to apply it, and maybe it's the same thing, but it feels different, right? Like, I'm sure both of you have been leaders on your high school team or your college team, but Connor, I'm sure when you became the leader of Cornell Lacrosse, the program, as a head coach, it felt different. And I even have felt that of, when Mike Earhart retired from the Whitsnakes 2 or 3 years ago, like Mike was our leader, and then it was kind of like, well, I'm not Mike. That guy, he was the best player I've ever seen. And he was like this larger than life impact on our team. And I think learning how to fill a role like that, but in your own way, is like such a skill. And I think I just echoing that authenticity piece, like there's not one right way to do it. But if you genuinely care about the mission of the team more than yourself, and you understand it, and you can show that in your actions, and then support that with your words that are just simply that you're communicating the importance of those actions, and that buy into the team, like people feel it when it's real. And that's the one thing I've taken away is it can be really intimidating if you look at somebody else who did a great job and you're like, man, I have to be that. Like, I can't be that. Like, yeah, you shouldn't be that. That's not you. So that just kind of stuck with me, because that's personally, like, I felt that multiple times. And every time I felt like I've made progress, it's been through leaning back into how can I do it that's the right way for me to do it, while still making sure the team comes first and you're buying in it and putting in the time and energy to make sure you're showing the right things.
No doubt. I think that's the interesting part. And honestly, I've actively tried to give away opportunities to speak at times, just knowing that what comes from our players, that if we are echoing the right message and different people are saying it in different ways, but having the similar theme, I think that goes a long way. And so, having more ownership from within, having more voices from within, I think has been a really successful thing for us. And I think it allows each guy to kind of be themselves, but not feeling like they're overwhelmed and have to be the mouthpiece for the whole team, that they're a part of a whole, and that each of them are bought into it and just saying it their own way.
Connor, one later one here before we start to wrap up. I was saying the Matt before, you're one of the first guys we've had on the podcast that was our era, playing against, which is pretty cool. And, I had some good games over the years. And I was curious, of your teammates that you had, who do you feel like was the most underrated guy that you played with?
It's a great question. One guy that I will always go back to, I played with Stephen Brooks in Florida, and then, on the Atlas. And he was a guy that I always looked up to. He took great care of me when I got to, Florida. He always looked out for me and tried to give me the tools and, the understanding of what it took to be successful at the professional level. I thought he was incredibly selfless. I thought he was a great leader. I thought he was a great captain. And, it's no surprise he's still doing incredible things on PL sidelines today. But he was a guy that, certainly was one of the very best for a really long time. And then even as, he was coming towards the tail end of his career, was still producing at a high level, but was leading and giving a lot to the team just by his presence and his communication and the confidence that he gave. So I think that's an easy one that comes to mind, that I still think the world of Brooksy, and love how he goes about his business, and honestly try to draw, thoughts from him consistently. And so, love when I get the opportunity to catch up with him.
Yeah. And how about one from Cornell for the Big Red Faithful?
I'm going to give you two, and they were part of the same class. They were captains together in 2013. But I think Steve Mock is perennially underrated for how good he was. And,
He was
he
so
was
good.
60, 65 goal scorer, was kind of the finisher side of a lot of Pinnell assists over the years. But just appreciated so much how he went about his business, and how he showed up every day, and how he treated me as a young guy on that team. And then the same class, there was a D middie that was a captain that year named Tom Trazzolini that I've consistently looked to and been appreciative for the way I watched him lead, to see him, have his voice, the way he competed. He was a guy that showed up every day and had that kind of lunch pail mentality. And so we learned a lot from that group. And, we were fortunate enough to go to the Final Four that year. And I think in large part because of the leadership group that led that team. And so, took a lot of lessons from those guys, and the way that whole class connected and led, I thought was always pretty impactful on me.
Well, that class did send me home my freshman year early in the playoff run in the quarterfinals at Maryland, actually. Yeah. Great team.
I think Mock had like 8 or 9 goals, if I remember correctly, in that game.
I mean, whatever. We had what I thought was a good game plan. It just did not work out. And yeah, I mean, you guys like Pinnell, Mock, like all you guys, like Donovan, you guys just had a team that I thought was very talented then, and to the point of culture, played so hard.
When we were catching up with Mikey Long too, he was talking about how he was obsessed with going back and watching Matt Donovan highlights and as well from that squad. So
I think that's a layup one too. I think he's as underrated as any. He was an incredible cross player.
He was great. Well, Connor, look, this was awesome. We want to respect your time here, but we appreciate you coming on. It's been so cool for us to, have seen you have so much success, considering, you and Jordan, both friends of ours and guys that, there's a bond when you go through the same cohort of college, even as competitors through the pro ranks, where not a lot of people kind of understand what that life really is. And so getting to play against you over the years, getting to play with you a few times, it's so cool to see you guys have the success you've had. We appreciate you coming on and sharing all this with us. We'll wrap up here, but just want to say thank you for taking the time to be here with us.
It's my pleasure, fellas. Thanks so much for having me on. It was awesome talking shop with you guys and just getting the opportunity to catch up. So thanks so much. Love what you guys are doing. Love following along what you guys are doing on the field, what you guys are doing in social media. I think it's pretty special, and you guys are great teachers. So thanks for having me on.
Appreciate it, Connor. Best of luck the rest of the fall and this spring. We'll be following.
Thanks, fellas.
Yeah.